Welcome back to Naptime Knowledge. Find your comfortable position. Let the day finish itself, all of it, all the noise and movement and effort, and let something quieter begin. Let your breathing be slow. Let your body be heavy. Let the world outside this room become very small and very far away. Tonight we are going to a place that is, in many respects, unlike anywhere else on Earth. A subcontinent of extraordinary diversity, of dozens of languages and hundreds of dialects, of snow-capped Himalayan peaks and sun-scorched desert, of tropical rainforests and vast river deltas, of ancient temple cities and jungle ruins, and some of the earliest planned urban settlements the world has ever known. We are going to ancient India. India is a civilization of extraordinary depth. It has been continuously inhabited for at least 75,000 years. Its oldest cities, the cities of the Indus Valley civilization, were flourishing more than 4,000 years ago, when their streets were laid out on precise grids and their houses had indoor plumbing systems that would not be matched in Europe for 2,000 years. Its religious and philosophical traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and dozens of smaller traditions, are among the oldest continuous intellectual and spiritual systems on Earth, still practiced by more than 1 billion people in forms that trace their ancestry directly back to the Vedic age of 3,000 years ago. India gave the world the number 0, without which modern mathematics and computing would be impossible. It gave the world the game of chess. It gave the world cotton textiles and the cultivation of sugar. It gave the world the philosophy of non-violence that would inspire, 2,500 years later, Mahatma Gandhi, and through him, the civil rights movements of the 20th century. And it gave the world some of the most beautiful poetry, architecture, sculpture, music, and storytelling traditions in all of human culture. This is a long, slow, gentle journey through that world. We will move through ancient India chapter by chapter, from its earliest cities to its great epics, from its religious traditions to its philosophy, from its daily life to its extraordinary art. Sleep will find you somewhere along the way. Let it come when it comes. Until then, let ancient India come to meet you. But before we begin, find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. Feel the weight of your limbs. Feel the surface beneath you, holding you completely. Gently close your eyes, or let your gaze go soft. We are going to breathe together for just a few moments, slowly, deeply, and with each breath, you will feel yourself becoming a little more relaxed, a little heavier, a little more ready for rest. Take your first breath in, slowly. Feel your chest and belly rise. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. Good. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go soft. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. With this breath, let go of the day. Whatever happened today, whatever you carried, whatever you managed, whatever you left unfinished, You can set it down now. It will be there if you need it tomorrow. Tonight, it can rest. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. Notice how heavy your body feels. Notice how quiet the room is. Notice how the breath moves through you like a slow, dark tide. In and out, unhurried and easy. You do not need to do anything right now. You do not need to be anywhere. You do not need to solve anything, or remember anything, or prepare for anything. The only thing that exists right now is this breath, and this quiet, and the story that is about to begin. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. When you are ready, let your breathing return to its own natural rhythm. Let it be effortless. And as you breathe, let the words of the story carry you slowly, gently, down towards sleep. Chapter 1. The Indus Valley Civilization. The Forgotten Cities. Our journey begins not in the jungle or the mountains, but in the desert, in the dry, flat plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, where one of the world's first great urban civilizations flourished for nearly 1,000 years, and then, quietly and mysteriously, disappeared. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, after the city of Harappa, where its ruins were first identified in the 19th century, was contemporary with ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. At its height, between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, it covered an area larger than either of those civilizations, stretching from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the coast of Gujarat in the south, from the Indus River in the west to the upper Ganges Valley in the east. Its population may have exceeded 5 million people, larger than the populations of Egypt and Mesopotamia combined at the same period. The cities of the Indus Valley are remarkable for their urban planning. The major cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which have been most extensively excavated, were laid out on precise grids, with streets running north-south and east-west, wider thoroughfares for major traffic, and narrower lanes for residential access. The buildings were constructed of standardized fired mud bricks, the same proportions used across the entire civilization, from its most distant outposts to its major centers, suggesting a degree of standardization and perhaps centralized control that is remarkable for a Bronze Age civilization. Most remarkably, almost every house in the major Indus Valley cities had its own bathroom and its own connection to a sophisticated drainage system. Wastewater flowed from the individual houses through covered brick drains into larger collector drains in the streets, and from there to outlets beyond the city. This is one of the earliest examples of urban sanitation infrastructure anywhere in the world, a level of civil engineering sophistication that would not appear in European cities until the 19th century, when cholera epidemics in London and Paris finally forced the construction of modern sewer systems. The Indus Valley cities also had large public buildings whose function is still debated. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a large watertight tank of fired brick set within a surrounding complex of rooms and colonnaded walkways may have been used for ritual bathing. The granaries that have been identified at several sites suggest centralized storage and redistribution of food. The citadel areas of the major cities, raised on artificial mounds above the lower residential areas, may have housed administrative or religious institutions. One of the most intriguing features of the Indus Valley civilization is how little we understand about it. Its script, found on thousands of small carved seals, on pottery and on other objects, has never been deciphered. We do not know what language the Harappan people spoke, what gods they worshipped, what their political system was, or what they called themselves. We cannot read their literature, if they had any, or their law codes, or their religious texts. The civilization exists for us primarily in its physical remains, its streets and drains and bricks and seals and small sculptures, without any verbal key to unlock its meaning. The seals themselves are objects of extraordinary beauty. Small, typically only 2 or 3 centimeters square, they are carved from a soft stone called steatite, with images of animals and humans, and figures that may be deities or priests or rulers, surrounded by lines of the undeciphered script. The animals depicted are some of the most vivid and most naturalistic in ancient art. A great rhinoceros, a tiger, a humped bull, a one-horned animal that may be a stylized representation of a real animal, or may be the ancestor of the unicorn myth that would later appear in Mesopotamia and Greece. Each seal is a small masterpiece of observation and craft. The Indus Valley civilization declined and eventually disappeared around 1900 BCE. The causes are still debated: climate change and the drying of the rivers that sustained the cities, the disruption of trade networks, internal social changes, or some combination of these factors have all been proposed. The cities were not violently destroyed. They seem to have been gradually abandoned as populations dispersed into smaller rural settlements. The civilization that had built the world's most sophisticated urban plumbing system simply walked away from its cities, and the cities were covered by the dust of centuries until archaeologists began to uncover them in the 1920s. What happened to the people of the Indus Valley? They did not disappear. They became part of the population of the Indian subcontinent, their genes and perhaps their cultural traditions blending into the great mix of peoples and traditions that would eventually produce the civilization we know as ancient India. The Indus Valley civilization is the deep root of Indian history. Old and largely silent, its language lost, its stories untold, but its DNA still present in the people of the subcontinent, and perhaps some echo of its traditions preserved in the religious and cultural practices that developed in the centuries that followed. Let the streets of Mohenjo-Daro settle into your imagination. Grid after grid of mud brick houses, the drains running beneath the streets, the great bath gleaming in the morning sun, the carved seals waiting in their workshops to be pressed into clay, a civilization that had everything, and then one day, slowly, was no more. The desert keeps its secrets. The river has changed course. The cities wait. Chapter 2. The Vedic Age. Songs of Fire and the Sacred. Around 1500 BCE, or perhaps somewhat earlier, groups of semi-nomadic pastoralists began entering the Indian subcontinent from the northwest, crossing the mountain passes of Afghanistan and settling in the Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers, where the Indus and its tributaries provided water for their cattle and their horses. These people spoke an early form of Sanskrit, a language related to ancient Persian and Greek and Latin, one of the branches of the great Indo-European language family that had spread across much of Eurasia in the preceding centuries. They brought with them a rich oral tradition of sacred poetry, hymns to their gods, songs for their rituals, prayers and spells, and philosophical reflections composed in a meter of great beauty and precision. These hymns were the Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedas, the most ancient texts in the Hindu tradition, and among the oldest religious texts in continuous use anywhere on earth. They have been transmitted orally from teacher to student with extraordinary precision for more than 3,000 years. The same words, the same syllables, the same metrical patterns, preserved in the living memory of the Brahmin priestly tradition. The Rigveda is a collection of 1,028 hymns addressed to the gods of the Vedic pantheon. Indra, the god of thunder and war, and the defeater of the cosmic serpent. Agni, the sacred fire, the intermediary between the human and the divine. Varuna, the god of cosmic order and the moral guardian of the universe. Surya, the sun god. Ushas, the goddess of the dawn. The hymns are composed in a Sanskrit of great beauty and complexity, rich in metaphor, dense with imagery, capable of moving from the concrete and immediate to the abstract and philosophical in the space of a single verse. The sacred fire, Agni, was the center of Vedic religious life. Every ritual act, every sacrifice, every rite of passage was conducted in the presence of fire. The fire was not merely a symbol of the divine, it was the divine, present in the world in a form that could be fed and tended and spoken to. The Vedic priests who maintained the sacred fires and performed the rituals were among the most specialized and most carefully trained practitioners of religious knowledge in the ancient world. The rituals they performed, including the great Soma sacrifice, in which the pressed juice of the Soma plant was offered to the gods and consumed by the priests, required years of training to execute correctly. What was Soma? It is one of the great mysteries of Vedic studies. The Rigveda describes it at length as a plant, as a drink, as a god, as the source of inspiration and divine vision. The pressed juice was described as golden or tawny, as intoxicating, as giving the drinker a sense of divine power and illumination. Scholars have proposed dozens of candidates for the original Soma plant: various mushrooms, ephedra, cannabis, morning glory, Syrian rue, without reaching a consensus. The identity of Soma was apparently lost sometime in the 1st millennium BCE, when the Vedic ritual tradition continued, but the original plant became unavailable, and various substitutes were used in its place. The Vedic age was not only a time of religious composition, it was also a time of settlement and expansion, as this Indo-Aryan peoples gradually moved east along the river valleys of northern India, clearing forest, establishing villages, developing agriculture alongside their original pastoralism. The interaction between the incoming peoples and the existing populations, whatever remained of the Indus Valley tradition, and the various other pre-existing cultures of the subcontinent produced the complex, layered civilization that would eventually become ancient India. The caste system, that ancient and deeply controversial feature of Indian social organization, appears to have its origins in the Vedic period, in the division of society into 4 varnas: the Brahmins, the priestly class, the Kshatriyas, the warrior and ruling class, the Vaishyas, the farmers and merchants, and the Shudras, the servants and laborers. A famous Rigvedic hymn, the Purusha Sukta, describes the cosmos as the body of a primordial cosmic being, the Purusha, from whose different body parts the 4 varnas emerged. The varna system was, in its original formulation, a description of cosmic and social order, though over the centuries it would become intertwined with hereditary birth in ways that produced the elaborate and often oppressive system that Indian society is still grappling with today. The late Vedic period, between roughly 800 and 500 BCE, saw the composition of the Upanishads, a remarkable body of philosophical prose and verse that asked the deepest questions about the nature of reality. Who are we? What is the universe? What is the relationship between the individual self and the ultimate reality? The Upanishads grappled with these questions with extraordinary sophistication, developing the concept of Brahman, the universal, impersonal ground of all being, and Atman, the individual soul or self, and exploring their relationship in ways that have influenced philosophical thought across the world for 2,500 years. The most famous teaching of the Upanishads, Tattvam Asi, that thou art, asserts the identity of the individual self with the universal ground of being. You are not separate from the ultimate reality of the universe. You are it, expressing itself in the particular form of this particular body and mind for this particular stretch of time. The boundary between self and world, between inner and outer, between the one and the many. This boundary is, at the deepest level, an illusion. There is only the one, expressing itself in countless forms. Let that thought settle gently into you, not as a philosophical proposition to be argued with, but as an image, the way a stone settles into water, sending ripples outward, but itself simply coming to rest. The fire is burning, the Sanskrit is being spoken, the ancient hymns are rising toward the sky, and somewhere in the smoke and the sound, something very old is saying, you are part of this. You have always been part of this. Chapter 3. The Ramayana and Mahabharata. The Great Epics. No account of ancient India would be complete without spending time in the world of its great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, 2 of the longest and most beloved works of literature in human history, and 2 of the most significant cultural monuments of Indian civilization. These are not merely stories. They are the living cultural inheritance of more than 1 billion people, endlessly retold, endlessly reinterpreted, endlessly relevant to the questions of how to live a good life and what it means to be human. The Ramayana, composed in its most celebrated Sanskrit form by the poet Valmiki, probably between the 5th and 1st centuries BCE, tells the story of Prince Rama, heir to the throne of Ayodhya, who is sent into exile for 14 years through a combination of palace intrigue and his own unimpeachable virtue. His wife Sita accompanies him into exile, along with his devoted brother Lakshmana. And then Sita is kidnapped by Ravana, the 10-headed demon king of Lanka, and the rest of the epic follows Rama's quest to find her and bring her home. This summary does not begin to convey the richness of the poem. The Ramayana is a work of extraordinary narrative beauty. Its descriptions of landscape and nature, of human emotion and divine intervention, of the bonds of love and loyalty and duty that tie its characters together, are among the finest in Sanskrit literature. The forests through which Rama and Sita walk in their exile are described with a botanist's precision and a poet's eye. The flowers and trees and birds named, their qualities evoked, the whole world of the Indian forest made present and vivid on the page. Rama himself is the ideal of the Kshatriya warrior, brave, just, devoted to Dharma, moderate in his appetites, respectful of his elders, faithful to his word. The Indian philosophical tradition calls him Maryada Purushottama, the best of men, the ideal human being, the one who lives perfectly according to the right order of things. He is also, in the later traditions of Hinduism, an avatar of the god Vishnu, a divine being who has taken human form to restore order to the cosmos and defeat the demonic force of Ravana. Sita is one of the most complex and most debated figures in all of Indian literature, a model of wifely devotion in one reading, a figure of extraordinary strength and moral clarity in another. Her abduction and her years of captivity, her rescue, and the painful aftermath, when her faithfulness is questioned by the people of Ayodhya, and she is sent into exile again, this time by Rama himself, have generated an enormous and ongoing conversation in Indian culture about the obligations of duty, the nature of justice, and the position of women in a patriarchal society. The Ramayana does not resolve these tensions. It holds them with honesty and with pain. The Mahabharata is larger, much larger. At roughly 100,000 verses, it is one of the longest works of literature ever composed, roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. It is, its own text claims, the repository of everything: dharma and artha and karma and moksha, duty and wealth and desire and liberation, everything that pertains to human life. Whatever is here, they say, may be found elsewhere. Whatever is not here is nowhere. The central narrative is a war, the great war of Kurukshetra, fought between two branches of the Kuru dynasty, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, for the throne of the kingdom of Hastinapura. The Pandavas, 5 brothers of extraordinary virtue and ability, have been cheated of their inheritance by their cousins, the 100 Kauravas, and after years of exile and failed negotiations, the war is the only resolution. The battle lasts 18 days and involves virtually every kingdom of the ancient Indian subcontinent. When it is over, almost everyone is dead. Embedded within the Mahabharata, just before the great battle begins, is the Bhagavad Gita, perhaps the most famous and most widely read of all ancient Indian texts. On the battlefield of Kurukshetra, the warrior Arjuna looks at the opposing army, his teachers, his cousins, his friends, and his bow falls from his hands. He cannot fight. He refuses, and his charioteer, who is revealed to be the god Krishna in human form, speaks to him across 14 chapters about the nature of duty, the nature of the soul, the nature of action, and the nature of the divine. The Gita's central teaching is the concept of nishkama karma, action without attachment to the fruits of action. Do your duty, Krishna tells Arjuna. Do what the role you have been given in the great drama of the cosmos requires of you. But do it without attachment to the outcome. Do not act from desire for reward or fear of punishment. Act from the simple recognition that this is what is required, that this is your dharma, that the action itself is your offering to the divine. The results belong to God, not to you. These teachings, composed roughly 2,500 years ago in the context of a mythological war, have been applied to situations as different as the meditation mat and the battlefield, the philosophical discussion and the political campaign. Mahatma Gandhi carried a copy of the Gita with him throughout his life and returned to it daily for guidance. Oppenheimer quoted it when he watched the first atomic bomb test. It speaks with a directness and a profundity that transcends its ancient context, addressing the universal human struggle between what we want to do and what we know we must do. Let the Gita's teaching rest in you tonight. You do not need to act on it now. You do not need to do anything. Tonight, your only duty is to rest, and you can perform that duty without attachment to how well you sleep, or how long it takes, or whether your mind is still or restless. Simply be here. Simply breathe. The action is the offering. The rest is already complete. Chapter 4. The Buddha, the Awakened One, and his teaching. In the 5th century BCE, in the foothills of what is now southern Nepal, a prince was born who would become one of the most influential human beings who ever lived. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was the son of the king of the Shakya clan, a man of wealth and privilege, surrounded from birth by everything that material comfort and aristocratic life could provide. He would eventually give all of it up, sit beneath a tree, and discover something that hundreds of millions of people for 2,500 years have found to be the most important truth anyone has ever articulated. The traditional account of Siddhartha's life is one of the great spiritual biographies of the world. Born into luxury, he was sheltered from the suffering of ordinary life by his father, who had been told by prophecy that his son would either become a great king or a great spiritual teacher, and who intended the former. The palace was kept beautiful. The sick and the old and the dying were kept out of sight. And Siddhartha grew up in a world of pleasure and plenty, unaware of the fundamental condition of human existence. And then, one by one, the truth broke through. On excursions from the palace, Siddhartha encountered an old man, bent and frail, and understood for the first time that old age was the destiny of every human being. He encountered a sick man, racked with pain, and understood that illness could come to anyone. He encountered a corpse being carried to cremation, and understood that death was universal and inevitable. These three sights, old age, sickness, death, shattered the comfortable fiction of his sheltered life and confronted him with the reality of dukkha, a Sanskrit word usually translated as suffering, but more precisely, meaning the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence. The fourth sight was a wandering ascetic, a monk, thin and simply dressed, but with a quality of peace about him that Siddhartha had never seen in the pleasure gardens of the palace. In that face, Siddhartha saw the possibility of a different relationship to the suffering of existence. Not the denial of it, as his father had attempted. Not the suppression of it through pleasure, but something else. A path through it to something on the other side. He left the palace. He left his wife and his infant son. He left everything that his privileged birth had given him and became a wandering seeker, studying with the best teachers of his time, practicing the most severe austerities, fasting until his body was skeletal, holding his breath until he felt faint, pushing the limits of physical endurance in the belief that liberation from suffering could be won through the mortification of the flesh. For 6 years he practiced this extreme asceticism and found that it led nowhere. The body was weakened, but the mind was no clearer. Suffering was not defeated. It was merely differently expressed. Finally, accepting food from a village girl and abandoning the extreme path of asceticism, he sat down beneath a fig tree, what we now call the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, in the town of Bodh Gaya, in what is now the state of Bihar, in northeastern India. And he resolved not to rise until he had found what he was seeking. The tradition describes what followed as a night of tremendous spiritual struggle, temptation and attack by Mara, the lord of delusion, who sent his daughters to seduce the meditator and his armies to frighten him, followed as dawn broke by something unprecedented in human experience. Siddhartha Gautama understood, not merely intellectually, not as a proposition to be believed or argued with, but with a certainty that was itself a form of experience, a direct seeing of the nature of reality that dissolved the ignorance that had been the root of his suffering and the suffering of all sentient beings. He had become the Buddha, the awakened one. What had he understood? The teaching that followed, given over 45 years of wandering and teaching throughout the Ganges Valley, is summarized in the 4 noble truths. That suffering exists, that suffering has a cause, which is craving and attachment, that suffering can cease, and that there is a path that leads to its cessation. That path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is a systematic program of ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom practice that aims to transform the way the mind relates to experience, reducing the craving and aversion and delusion that are the sources of suffering. The Buddha's teaching is remarkable for its practical and psychological orientation. It does not begin with metaphysics or cosmology or theology. It begins with the simple, undeniable fact of suffering and asks, what causes it? And is there a way out? The answer is empirical rather than doctrinal. You can verify it yourself, through practice, through observation of your own mind. You do not have to take it on faith. You can see for yourself whether the teaching is true. This emphasis on direct experience, on the investigation of one's own mind as the primary laboratory of spiritual inquiry, is one of the most distinctive features of Buddhism, and one of the reasons it has found receptive audiences in such diverse cultural contexts, from ancient India to modern Silicon Valley. The Buddha was not asking for belief. He was offering a method, a way of looking at experience that, if practiced, would reveal the nature of suffering and the possibility of liberation from it. Rest in the image of the Bodhi tree tonight, the fig tree whose descendant still stands at Bodh Gaya, sheltered by a temple, visited by pilgrims from every Buddhist country in the world. Under that tree, at dawn, 2,500 years ago, something awakened. Something understood itself. And in the understanding, suffering loosened its grip, just a little for the first time, and then a little more, and then more, and the teaching of how to loosen it has been spreading ever since. The Buddhist teaching on impermanence, anicca, is one of its most important and most practically useful insights. Everything that exists is impermanent. Every thought arises and passes. Every sensation arises and passes. Every emotion arises and passes. Every relationship, every circumstance, every state of the body and the mind is in constant flux, never fixed, never permanent. The suffering that comes from clinging, from the attempt to hold on to what is pleasant and push away what is unpleasant, comes from this fundamental truth, being resisted rather than accepted. The acceptance of impermanence is not resignation, it is clarity. When you truly understand that a pleasant experience will pass, you can appreciate it fully without grasping at it. When you truly understand that an unpleasant experience will pass, you can endure it without being overwhelmed by it. When you understand that this very moment, with all its particular qualities, pleasant and unpleasant and neutral, will pass and be replaced by another moment, you can be present to it fully, without either clinging or fleeing. Tonight is impermanent. The discomfort of this day is impermanent. The particular quality of this darkness, this quiet, this edge of sleep, all impermanent. And in the impermanence, there is a strange freedom. The freedom of knowing that nothing needs to be held on to, that you can let go, that the next moment will come without any effort on your part, that sleep will come when it comes, and the morning will come when it comes, and the whole stream of experience will continue to flow, with or without your anxious management of it. Let it flow. Let the thoughts pass like clouds. Let the body sink deeper into whatever holds it. The Bodhi tree is still standing. The river at Varanasi is still flowing. The wheel of Dharma is still turning. And somewhere in all of this turning and flowing, there is a stillness, the stillness that the Buddha found under the tree, that is always available, always present, just beneath the surface of the movement. Chapter 5. The Maurya Empire, Ashoka and the Wheel of Law. By the 4th century BCE, the political landscape of India had been transformed. The small kingdoms and republics of the Vedic period had given way to larger states, and the largest of these, the Magadha kingdom, with its capital at Pataliputra on the Ganges, was on the verge of becoming something new, the first empire to unify most of the Indian subcontinent under a single rule. The Maurya Empire was founded around 321 BCE by Chandragupta Maurya, who seized power in Magadha with the assistance of his brilliant minister Chanakya, a political philosopher whose handbook on statecraft, the Arthashastra, is one of the most remarkable political texts of the ancient world. The Arthashastra is unflinchingly practical. It discusses diplomacy and war and taxation and espionage and the management of a complex state with the systematic thoroughness of a manual rather than a philosophical treatise. Some scholars have compared it to Machiavelli's The Prince, though it is older by nearly 2,000 years and considerably more comprehensive. Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, who came to the throne around 268 BCE, would become one of the most extraordinary rulers in the history of the world. He began his reign as a conqueror, extending the empire southward in a series of military campaigns, and then experienced something that transformed him utterly. The conquest of Kalinga, a kingdom on the eastern coast of India, was won at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Soldiers killed, civilians displaced, entire communities destroyed. Ashoka looked at what his victory had done and was horrified. He converted to Buddhism. He renounced war as an instrument of policy, not merely as a tactical choice, but as a moral commitment. And he began a program of governance that has no real parallel in the ancient world. A systematic attempt to rule according to the principle of Dharma, understood as righteousness, compassion, and the welfare of all living beings. The rock edicts, inscriptions that Ashoka had carved on rocks and pillars throughout his vast empire, in multiple languages, including Greek for the Hellenistic communities in the northwest, are the primary documentary evidence of his transformed rule. They are remarkable documents. They describe his remorse for the suffering caused by the conquest of Kalinga. They announce policies of animal welfare, the prohibition of certain forms of hunting, the establishment of veterinary services, the creation of rest houses for travelers, and shade trees along roads. They announce tolerance of all religious sects. They express concern for the welfare of neighboring peoples, even those beyond the empire's borders. One edict reads, "All men are my children. Just as I desire for my children that they should obtain every kind of welfare and happiness in this world and in the next, I desire the same for all men." The reader is astonished. This was written 2,300 years ago by a man who had just fought one of the most destructive wars in the history of the subcontinent, and who had found in the suffering he caused the motivation to rule differently. Ashoka sent Buddhist missionaries throughout the known world, to Sri Lanka, to Southeast Asia, to Central Asia, to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the West. Buddhist communities were established in Alexandria, in Antioch, in Syria. His son and daughter carried the faith to Sri Lanka, where it would develop into the Theravada tradition that is still practiced today in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. His missionaries went to what is now Afghanistan and Iran, to Greece and Egypt. The global spread of Buddhism that we traced in the Silk Road script began in large part with Ashoka's deliberate missionary program. The Maurya Empire did not long survive Ashoka. After his death in 232 BCE, the empire began to fragment, and by 185 BCE, it had collapsed entirely. But its legacy, in the spread of Buddhism, in the administrative systems that subsequent Indian empires inherited, in the edicts that still stand carved on their rocks and pillars, in the wheel of Dharma that Ashoka made the symbol of his reformed rule, endured. That wheel, the Dharma Chakra, is still the central symbol on the flag of the Republic of India. When India gained independence from British rule in 1947, after a non-violent independence movement explicitly modelled on Ashoka's principles and Gandhi's interpretation of them, the new nation chose as its emblem not a lion or an eagle or a sword, but a wheel. The wheel of law, the wheel of right action, the wheel that Ashoka set spinning more than 2,000 years ago. Breathe deeply. The wheel is turning. It has been turning for a very long time. And somewhere in the turning, in the long arc of cause and consequence, there is the suggestion that right action, however imperfectly realized, however long delayed in its effects, does not simply disappear. It continues in forms that the actor could not have foreseen, doing its quiet work in the fabric of history. Chapter 6. Hindu Philosophy, Brahman, Atman, and the Nature of Reality. Indian philosophy is one of the great intellectual traditions of the world, as sophisticated, as rigorous, and as varied as anything produced by ancient Greece or medieval Europe, and largely unknown to most people outside the Indian tradition. Tonight, we will spend a little time in its depths, moving slowly, because the ideas are genuinely complex, but allowing them to work on us the way good ideas do when the mind is relaxed and open. At the heart of Hindu philosophy is the concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of being, the one that underlies the many. Brahman is not a god in the sense of a person or a being with intentions and preferences and a relationship with human beings. Brahman is more fundamental than any particular being. It is the beingness that all beings share, the awareness that underlies all awareness, the existence that makes all particular existences possible. It is not outside the world, looking down on it. It is the world from the inside, the reality that the world is, rather than a reality that created the world. This may sound abstract, and it is. The Upanishads approach it through a series of analogies and thought experiments that try to make the ungraspable at least imaginable. In the Chandogya Upanishad, a father tries to explain Brahman to his son through a series of experiments. He asks his son to dissolve a lump of salt in water and then to taste the water at various points: the top, the middle, the bottom. The salt is everywhere, in everything, pervading the whole, not to be seen, but present. That, says the father, is how Brahman is in you. That art thou. The individual self, Atman, is, in the deepest analysis, identical with Brahman. The apparent separateness of individual things, this self and that self, this tree and that rock, this moment and that moment, is not ultimate. It is real in a practical, everyday sense. You are really you and I am really me, and we really are different from each other in all the ways that matter for getting through the day. But at the deepest level, the level that the Upanishads are trying to point to, the distinction dissolves. There is only Brahman, experiencing itself through the countless particular forms of a universe in constant motion. The concept of Maya, often translated as illusion, describes the way that the ordinary mind experiences the world, as a collection of separate, independent things, rather than as the single, unified reality that underlies them. Maya is not saying that the world is unreal, or that your experiences and relationships and sufferings and joys do not matter. It is saying that the way we habitually interpret our experience as fundamentally separate from everything else, as bounded and isolated selves in a world of objects, is a kind of misperception, a failure to see the deeper truth of what is actually happening. The philosophical school known as Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta, developed most fully by the 8th century philosopher Adi Shankaracharya, is the most radical expression of this non-dualism. For Shankara, Brahman alone is real. Everything else, the world as we experience it, the multiplicity of individual beings, the apparent distinctions between self and other, is Maya, superimposed on Brahman by the ignorance that is itself the fundamental problem of existence. Liberation, moksha, is the dissolution of this ignorance, the direct realization of the non-dual nature of reality. Other philosophical schools within Hinduism take different positions. The Vishishtadvaita of Ramanuja, qualified non-dualism, holds that individual selves and the material world are real, but are the body of Brahman, understood as the personal god, Vishnu. The Dvaita of Madhvacharya holds that individual selves, the material world, and God are genuinely distinct. The 6 orthodox philosophical schools of Hinduism, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta, explore the implications of different metaphysical positions with a rigor and a subtlety that rewards serious study. The Yoga philosophy, derived from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, compiled sometime around the 2nd century CE, is perhaps the most practically oriented of the Indian philosophical traditions. At least, it is the one with which most people in the modern world have some familiarity, though often in a form that has been considerably simplified from Patanjali's systematic and demanding original. The Yoga Sutras describe a path of systematic mental training, involving ethical restraint, physical practice, breath control, withdrawal of the senses from external objects, concentration, meditation, and ultimately samadhi, a state of deep absorption in which the ordinary distinction between subject and object dissolves. The goal of yoga, in Patanjali's formulation, is chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of the modifications of the mind. The mind, in its ordinary state, is constantly moving, generating thoughts, memories, fantasies, fears, desires, judgments. This constant movement obscures the pure awareness that is the true nature of the self. When the movement stops, not through suppression, but through the cultivation of a quality of clear, undisturbed attention, what remains is the self in its natural state, luminous, still, aware. As you lie here tonight, let the chitta vritti, the modifications of the mind, settle naturally, not by forcing them to stop, not by suppressing the thoughts that arise, but by simply not following them, by letting them arise and pass the way clouds arise and pass across an otherwise clear sky. The sky does not become the clouds. The awareness is not the thought. The self that is watching the thoughts is quieter than any of the thoughts it watches. Rest in that watcher. Rest in the still point at the center of the turning world. Chapter 7. The Gupta Empire, India's Golden Age. The Gupta Empire, which dominated northern India from roughly 320 to 550 CE, is often called the Golden Age of India, a period of extraordinary artistic, literary, scientific, and philosophical achievement that produced some of the finest works in the entire Indian cultural tradition. It is worth dwelling in this period because it gives us such a vivid picture of what ancient Indian civilization could be at its most confident and its most creative. The Gupta period saw the composition of some of the greatest Sanskrit literature. Kalidasa, perhaps the finest poet and playwright in the Sanskrit tradition, and a figure sometimes compared to Shakespeare for the scope and beauty of his work, composed his major works during or near this period. His poem, Meghaduta, the Cloud Messenger, tells the story of a yaksha, a spirit who has been exiled from his home in the Himalayan mountains and asks a passing rain cloud to carry a message to his wife. The poem is an extended meditation on longing and separation and the beauty of the Indian landscape, written in a meter of extraordinary musical richness. Kalidasa's play, Abhijnana Shakuntala and the Ring of Recognition, was one of the first Sanskrit works to be translated into European languages in the 18th century, and it caused a sensation. The German poet Goethe, reading the translation, wrote, "Would you seize the blossoms of the spring and the fruits that the autumn supplies, whatever enchants and enraptures, feeds the soul and contents?" Naming all this in a single word, Shakuntala tells it, and all is expressed. It is a love story of great delicacy and emotional intelligence, and it demonstrates the extraordinary refinement of the dramatic and poetic tradition that the Gupta period had inherited and extended. The Gupta period was also a time of extraordinary scientific achievement. Aryabhata, working in the late 5th century CE, calculated the value of pi to 4 decimal places, developed methods for solving quadratic equations, and proposed, more than 1,000 years before Copernicus, that the Earth rotates on its axis and that the apparent movement of the stars is a consequence of the Earth's rotation rather than the stars themselves moving. He also calculated the length of the solar year with remarkable precision. His figure of 365 days, 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 30 seconds is only a few minutes off from the modern value. Brahmagupta, working in the 7th century CE, made further advances in algebra and arithmetic, including the first systematic treatment of zero as a number in its own right, with defined rules for its behavior in arithmetic operations. The concept of zero, the placeholder that makes positional notation possible, the number that represents absence, the nothing that is something, is one of the most consequential intellectual contributions in the history of mathematics. Without zero, there is no place value system. Without place value, there is no decimal arithmetic as we know it. Without decimal arithmetic, there is no modern mathematics, no physics, no chemistry, no computing. The zero, born in ancient India, passed to the Islamic world along the Silk Road and then to Europe, underlies everything. The art of the Gupta period is among the most beautiful in all of Indian history. The bronze sculptures of this era, particularly the images of the Buddha, which achieved a canonical form during this period that influenced Buddhist art throughout Asia, are works of extraordinary serenity and refinement. The face of the Gupta period Buddha, with its half-closed eyes and its expression of compassionate equanimity, is one of the most recognizable artistic images in the world. The cave temples of Ajanta, carved into a horseshoe-shaped cliff in Maharashtra, contain Gupta period wall paintings of astonishing quality, scenes from the Jataka tales and the life of the Buddha, rendered in colors that, even after 15 centuries, retain much of their original vivacity. The Gupta period also saw the full elaboration of the temple architecture that is one of the most distinctive contributions of ancient India to the world's architectural heritage. The Hindu temple, in its mature form, is not simply a building in which religious ceremonies take place. It is a cosmological diagram, a representation in stone of the structure of the universe, its towers symbolizing Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the world, its inner sanctuary, the cave at the heart of the mountain where the god dwells. The worshipper who enters the temple follows a path from the outer world of ordinary experience inward toward the divine presence, moving from the profane to the sacred through a carefully designed sequence of spaces. The great temple complexes of southern India, Madurai, Chidambaram, Thanjavur, with their towering gopurams, the gateway towers covered from base to summit with thousands of sculpted figures of gods and demons and heroes, are among the most visually overwhelming architectural ensembles in the world. They were built over many centuries by successive dynasties, each adding new structures, new courtyards, new gopurams, until the temples became cities within cities, centers of religious, cultural, and economic life that served as the organizing institutions of entire regions. Breathe deeply. Let the image of the temple settle around you, the carved figures in the flickering lamplight, the smell of incense and flowers, the sound of bells and chanting, the dark inner sanctuary where the flame burns before the image of the god. This is a space designed to carry you from the ordinary to the sacred, from the scattered to the concentrated, from the restless to the still. And perhaps, right now, in the dark and the quiet, you are already there. Chapter 7 continued. The Gupta Legacy. The Gupta period ended not in a single dramatic fall, but in a gradual weakening. The invasions of the Huns from Central Asia in the 5th and 6th centuries disrupted the political stability that had made the Golden Age possible, and the empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms. But the cultural tradition it had established didn't disappear. The mathematical methods of Aryabhata were preserved and developed by subsequent generations of Indian scholars. The philosophical schools of the Gupta period continued to debate and refine their positions. The classical literary tradition survived in the courts of the regional kingdoms that succeeded the empire, and the great temple-building tradition continued, eventually producing the extraordinary temple complexes of medieval India that are among the glories of the world's architectural heritage. The Golden Age is a concept that every civilization applies to some period of its past, a time of exceptional flourishing, of creative confidence, of beauty and achievement that subsequent generations look back on with a kind of wistful admiration. For India, the Gupta period holds this place in the cultural memory, and it earned it. What was accomplished in those 2 centuries, in mathematics and astronomy and literature and philosophy and art and medicine, represents the full flowering of a civilization that had been developing its roots for more than 3,000 years. And the fruits of that flowering are still present in the world, in the decimal system, in the value of pi, in the Sanskrit poetry that is still memorized and recited, in the temple images that are still worshipped, in the philosophical tradition that is still studied and debated. Let the lamp of the Gupta age burn quietly in your mind tonight. Golden, warm, illuminating just enough to show the faces of scholars bent over their manuscripts, the hands of sculptors working the stone, the voice of a poet composing in the meter that has been refined for 1,000 years. The lamp does not need to illuminate everything. A small, warm light in a large dark is enough to make the dark feel inhabited rather than empty. Chapter 8. Daily life in ancient India. Markets, monsoons, and the river. Beyond the temples and the epics and the philosophy, ancient India was a world of ordinary days, of farmers and merchants, of fishermen and weavers, of mothers and children, of the rhythms of the agricultural year, and the daily rituals of the household. This world is less visible in the grand narratives of ancient Indian history, but it is where most people lived, and it is worth pausing to see it. The Indian subcontinent is dominated by the monsoon, the great seasonal reversal of winds that brings rain from the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea inland across the subcontinent between roughly June and September. The monsoon is not merely a meteorological event. It is the organizing principle of Indian agricultural life, of Indian religious life, of Indian culture itself. The arrival of the monsoon, after the brutal heat of the long, dry season, is one of the most emotionally powerful events in the Indian calendar. The first rains are celebrated with a relief and a joy that is expressed in poetry and music and dance, and the simple pleasure of standing in the rain after months of dust and heat. The great rivers of India, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yamuna, the Godavari, the Krishna, the Kaveri, are not merely geographical features. They are sacred presences, worshipped as goddesses, bathed in as acts of purification, cremated beside as the last passage from this life to the next. The Ganges in particular, the Ganga as she is known, is the most sacred river in the Hindu tradition, believed to have descended from heaven through the matted hair of the god Shiva, her waters possessing the power to purify sin and to ease the passage of the dead into the afterlife. To bathe in the Ganga, to drink her water, to have one's ashes scattered on her surface. These are among the most desired religious acts in the Hindu tradition, and they draw hundreds of millions of pilgrims to her banks every year. The great pilgrimage cities along the Ganges, Varanasi, Allahabad, Haridwar, Rishikesh, have been centers of religious life for thousands of years. Varanasi in particular is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. People have been living and praying and dying and being cremated on its guts, the broad stone steps descending to the river, for at least 3,000 years and perhaps much longer. To die in Varanasi is, in the Hindu tradition, to be guaranteed liberation, because Shiva himself is said to whisper the mantra of liberation into the ear of the dying, ensuring their release from the cycle of rebirth. The markets of ancient Indian cities were places of extraordinary variety. The textiles of India, cotton and silk, dyed in brilliant colors with natural dyes from plants and minerals, were among the most prized commodities in the ancient world, traded along the Silk Road and the maritime routes to every part of the known world. Indian spices, pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, ginger, turmeric, flavored the food of Rome and Persia and China. Indian ivory and precious stones adorned the courts of every major empire from the Mediterranean to East Asia. The economy of ancient India was embedded in a global trading system of remarkable reach. The craft traditions of India, metalwork, wood carving, stone sculpture, textile weaving, ceramics, jewelry making, were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. The artisans who practiced these crafts organized themselves into guilds, shrene, which regulated training and quality standards, provided credit to members, and negotiated with customers and rulers on behalf of the craft community. These guilds were among the most powerful economic institutions in ancient India, their influence stretching from the management of individual workshops to the sponsorship of temple construction and the financing of long-distance trade expeditions. The food of ancient India was already recognizably the food of India today. Rice and wheat were the primary grains, prepared in dozens of ways. Lentils and pulses were staples of the everyday diet. Vegetables were seasoned with turmeric and ginger and mustard seeds, and the dozens of other spices that grew throughout the subcontinent. Ghee, clarified butter, was the primary cooking fat, valued not only for its culinary properties, but for its ritual significance. The cooking of ancient India was already regional and diverse. The cuisine of the Ganges Valley, quite different from that of the south. The food of the coasts rich in fish and coconut in ways that the inland cuisines were not. The domestic life of ancient India was organized around the concept of the ashrama, the 4 stages of life. The student stage, in which young people devoted themselves to education and training. The householder stage, in which adults married and raised families and participated in the economic and social life of the community. The forest dweller stage, in which older adults gradually withdrew from worldly responsibilities and devoted themselves to spiritual practice. And the renunciant stage, in which some individuals completed their withdrawal from the world entirely, becoming wandering ascetics, dedicated solely to liberation. This 4-stage model was an ideal, not always realized in practice, but it expressed something important about the Indian understanding of the human life course. The idea that different stages of life have different appropriate activities and different appropriate priorities, and that wisdom involves knowing which stage you are in and living accordingly. The student who acts like a householder is confused. The householder who acts like a renunciant has abandoned the duties of their stage. The renunciant who is still preoccupied with worldly concerns has not yet made the transition they thought they had made. What stage are you in tonight? It doesn't matter for the purposes of this moment. Tonight, the only appropriate activity is sleep, the nightly renunciation of consciousness that restores the body and the mind, that returns you briefly to something like the state before thought, that makes possible another day of whatever your particular stage of life requires. Rest then. The ancient rivers are flowing. The monsoon has passed. The stars over the Ganges are very bright and very old, and somewhere on the river, a lamp set on a small raft of leaves is floating downstream in the dark, carrying its small flame toward the sea. Chapter 9. Yoga and Meditation, the Inner Science. Of all the gifts that ancient India has given to the modern world, perhaps none has traveled further or reached more people than the practices of yoga and meditation. In their modern forms, adapted and often simplified for a global audience, these practices are now used by hundreds of millions of people in every country on earth, not primarily for religious reasons, but for their demonstrable effects on mental and physical health, on stress reduction, on the quality of attention and the depth of sleep. It is worth spending a little time with the original context and the original purpose of these practices, because understanding where they come from illuminates what they are trying to do and what they might, practiced with sufficient depth and dedication, actually accomplish. The word yoga comes from the Sanskrit root yuj, meaning to yoke or to join, the same root as the English word yoke, reflecting the common Indo-European linguistic ancestry. Yoga is the practice of joining, the joining of individual awareness with the universal ground of being, of Atman with Brahman, of the scattered and distracted mind with the clear and undivided awareness that is its natural state beneath the constant movement of thought. The physical postures, asana, that most people today associate with yoga were, in the original system, only one of 8 limbs of practice, and not the most important one. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras describe asana simply as a stable and comfortable seat, the ability to sit for extended periods of meditation without physical discomfort. The elaborate system of postures that modern yoga has developed and that fills the classes and studios and YouTube videos of the contemporary world is largely a development of the last 2 centuries, drawing on older Indian physical training traditions and on modern gymnastic influences. The other limbs of Patanjali's yoga are ethical practices, yama, restraints, and niyama, observances, that include non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, moderation, and non-possessiveness. Pranayama, the regulation and extension of breath. Pratyahara, the withdrawal of attention from external sense objects. Dharana, concentration, the gathering of attention on a single object. Dhyana, meditation, the sustained, uninterrupted flow of attention toward the object of concentration. And samadhi, the state of deep absorption in which the distinction between the meditator, the act of meditation, and the object of meditation dissolves. This is a remarkable system. It is not asking for belief in anything. It is not requiring the practitioner to accept any particular theology. It is simply describing what happens when the mind is trained, systematically, patiently, over years of practice, to be less scattered and more present, less reactive and more clear. The result of this training, in Patanjali's account, is increasing freedom from suffering. Not because the circumstances of life become easier, but because the mind's relationship to those circumstances changes. The meditation traditions of Buddhism, which emerged from the same Indian cultural context as yoga, share many of the same basic practices while embedding them in a different philosophical framework. The Theravada practice of vipassana, insight meditation, involves the systematic, moment-to-moment observation of present experience, with particular attention to the arising and passing of sensations thoughts and emotions, and to the three characteristics that all conditioned phenomena share: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the absence of a fixed, unchanging self. Modern neuroscience has confirmed many of the effects that traditional accounts of meditation describe. Regular meditation practice, even relatively modest amounts, practiced consistently over months and years, produces measurable changes in the structure and function of the brain. Increased thickness in the prefrontal cortex, associated with attention and emotional regulation. Decreased activity in the default mode network, associated with mind wandering and rumination. Changes in the amygdala response to emotional stimuli. Improved immune function. Reduced levels of inflammatory markers in the blood. The ancient practice has modern evidence, and the ancient practitioners have been joined by scientists and doctors and therapists in recommending it. Tonight, you do not need to practice meditation in any formal sense, but the state you are moving toward, the state of drifting on the edge of sleep, when thoughts arise and dissolve without the mind grasping them, when the body is heavy and still, and the attention is soft and unfocused. This state has something in common with the early stages of meditation. The yoga tradition would call it a form of pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses from external objects. The attention is turning inward. The outer world is growing quiet. The inner world is growing still. Let it grow still. There is nothing to do. There is nowhere to go. The ancient yogis who sat in their caves and their forest clearings, watching the movement of their own minds for years and decades, were looking for something they called the Atman, the true self, the one that remains when all the movement stops. Tonight, you do not need to find the Atman. You just need to sleep. But perhaps, as you drift toward it, you can feel something of what they were pointing at. The quiet that is already here, underneath the thoughts, waiting to be noticed. Chapter 10. The Sacred Arts, Music, Dance, and the Aesthetics of Devotion. Ancient India understood the arts as paths to the divine, not merely entertainment or decoration, but as forms of practice, of offering, of the human reaching toward something transcendent through the cultivation of beauty. This understanding shaped one of the richest and most technically sophisticated artistic traditions in the world. The classical music of India, both the Hindustani tradition of the north and the Carnatic tradition of the south, is built on a foundation of extraordinary complexity and depth. The raga system, a framework of melodic modes, each associated with specific scales and characteristic phrases and particular times of day or seasons of the year or emotional states, provides the basis for improvisation, within which the performer creates music that is simultaneously rule-governed and freely invented. A skilled musician improvising in a raga late at night, with the particular scale and phrases and emotional character associated with that time, creates something that is at once an expression of individual creativity and a participation in a tradition thousands of years old. The emotional theory of Indian classical music and dance, the rasa theory, attributed to the ancient theorist Bharata in his text, the Natya Shastra, composed perhaps 2,000 years ago, identifies 8 primary rasas, or emotional flavors: love, humor, sorrow, anger, courage, fear, disgust, and wonder. Great art in this theory evokes one or more of these rasas in the audience, not by depicting the emotion directly, but by creating the conditions in which the audience can experience the emotion purified and universalized, freed from the specific personal associations that usually accompany it in ordinary life. The grief you feel at a great performance of a raga associated with pathos is not your grief for your specific losses. It is grief itself, universal, human, beautiful in its completeness. The classical dance traditions of India, Bharatanatyam, Odissi, Kathak, Manipuri, Kuchipudi, and several others, are among the most technically demanding and most visually spectacular performing arts in the world. They combine precise body positions and hand gestures, the mudras, which can represent objects, concepts, emotions, divine qualities, and the names of the gods, with intricate footwork, facial expression, and the narration of stories from mythology through the medium of the dancer's body. A master dancer of the Bharatanatyam tradition can use the 108 codified hand gestures to tell the entire story of the Ramayana without speaking a word. The temple dancing tradition, in which trained Devadasi dancers served as wives of the god, performing ritual dances in the inner sanctuaries of the great temples as acts of devotion, is one of the most controversial aspects of the classical Indian artistic tradition, because it was intertwined with a social system that often exploited the women who performed these roles. The dance forms themselves, however, rescued and revived in the 20th century by cultural reformers who separated them from the temple service system and brought them onto the concert stage, are among the most beautiful things the human body can do. The visual arts of ancient India, sculpture in stone and bronze, painting in fresco and miniature, were understood as forms of spiritual practice for the artists who made them. The craftsman who carved the image of a deity was believed to need not merely technical skill, but a quality of inner absorption, a meditative state in which the divine form could be perceived and transmitted through the hands into the material. The canonical texts that described the proportions and attributes of divine images, the Shilpa Shastras, were not merely technical manuals. They were descriptions of a spiritual ideal, a form of the divine that the artist was asked to make visible in the world. The temple sculptures of India, from the erotic carvings of Khajuraho to the serene Buddha images of Sarnath, to the dynamic dancing Shivas of the south, express a range of human and divine experience that is difficult to match in any other sculptural tradition. They are not idealized in the Greek sense, not the perfect, calm, marble athletes of the Parthenon. They are vivid, physical, full of movement and emotion, and the specific qualities of the divine or human being depicted. A dancing Shiva, the Nataraja, the Lord of Dance, is not a static image of a god. It is the universe in motion, creation and destruction, held simultaneously in the circle of a single moment. Ancient India understood something about beauty that our own culture sometimes forgets, that the beautiful is not separate from the sacred, that the making of something beautiful, with full attention and full skill and full devotion to the quality of what is being made, is itself a form of worship, that the experience of beauty, in music, in dance, in the image of a god, in the perfect turn of a Sanskrit verse, is a form of spiritual experience, a moment when the ordinary separation between self and world dissolves, and something larger comes through. Let that dissolving happen now. Let the music, which you do not need to hear with your ears to feel, play in the quiet of your mind. The sitar and the tabla, and the human voice in the raga, appropriate to this late hour. The dancer's foot on the floor, the flame in the temple, the river under the stars. India is a very old place, and tonight it is very quiet, and the stillness of it can reach all the way here, to wherever you are lying in the dark, if you will let it. Chapter 11. Jainism, the philosophy of non-harm. Alongside Buddhism, another great religion was born in ancient India in roughly the same period, emerging from the same philosophical ferment, grappling with the same questions about the nature of suffering and liberation, and arriving at answers that were at once similar and distinct. This is Jainism, one of the oldest living religions in the world, and perhaps the one that has taken the principle of non-violence most seriously and most rigorously of any tradition on earth. The Jain tradition traces its origins to a sequence of 24 spiritual teachers called Tirthankaras, ford makers, those who have crossed the river of suffering and show others the way. The last and most recent of these, Vardhamana Mahavira, was a contemporary of the Buddha. Both lived in the Ganges Valley in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Both came from warrior aristocratic backgrounds, and both renounced their privileged lives to become wandering ascetics in search of liberation. Their paths diverged significantly in their specific teachings, but they shared a common rejection of the Vedic ritual tradition and a common emphasis on the direct, personal experience of liberation rather than the mediation of priests or the efficacy of sacrifices. Mahavira practiced austerity of a severity that went considerably beyond what the Buddha, after his middle way insight, was willing to recommend. He wandered naked through the forests of northeastern India for 12 years, enduring extreme cold and heat and hunger, and the attacks of hostile animals and people, meditating with extraordinary intensity, until he achieved what the Jain tradition calls Kevala Jnana, omniscient knowledge, the complete and perfect understanding of the nature of reality. After achieving this knowledge, he spent the remaining 30 years of his life teaching, and the community he founded, the Jain Sangha, has maintained an unbroken tradition of practice from his time to the present. The central principle of Jain ethics is ahimsa, non-violence, non-harming, applied with a thoroughness and a consistency that no other tradition has matched. For the Jain monk or nun, ahimsa means not merely refraining from killing animals, but taking every possible precaution to avoid harming any living being, however small. The most strictly observant Jain monks sweep the path before them as they walk to avoid treading on insects. They strain their drinking water to remove microorganisms. They wear masks over their mouths to prevent accidentally inhaling insects. They do not eat after sunset, because the lamps used in darkness attract and kill insects. They do not eat root vegetables, because pulling them from the ground destroys the plants and potentially harms the creatures living in the soil. This may seem extreme, but it expresses a philosophical position of extraordinary coherence and moral seriousness. In Jain metaphysics, every living thing has a soul, a jiva, and every soul has inherent value, is deserving of consideration, and is capable of suffering. The cosmic community of souls is not limited to the souls of beings we consider important or beautiful or useful to us. It includes every living thing, from the highest divine being to the most microscopic organism. Harming any of them incurs karma. In the Jain understanding, karma is not an abstract cosmic principle, but a subtle material substance that adheres to the soul as a consequence of harmful action and weighs it down, preventing its liberation. The Jain concept of anikantavada, non-one-sidedness, the doctrine of many-sidedness, is one of the most sophisticated contributions of the Jain philosophical tradition to Indian thought. It holds that reality is complex and multifaceted, and that any statement about reality captures only one aspect of a truth that has infinitely many aspects. From one perspective, the jar is full. From another, it is empty. Both statements are true. Each is the truth from one perspective. The person who insists that their perspective is the only correct one has missed the complexity of reality. Anikantavada is not relativism. It is not saying that all perspectives are equally valid or that truth is merely subjective. It is saying that reality is richer than any single perspective can capture, and that the cultivation of wisdom includes the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to understand how the same reality looks different from different vantage points, to refrain from the dogmatic insistence that one's own partial view is the whole truth. The Jain community in India today numbers roughly 5 million people, small relative to the total population, but disproportionately influential in Indian cultural and intellectual life, particularly in commerce and in the practice of vegetarianism, which the Jain emphasis on ahimsa has popularized far beyond the Jain community itself. The Jain tradition of scholarship and of the preservation of manuscripts. Jain monasteries historically maintained extensive libraries of Sanskrit and Prakrit texts, has been an important contributor to the preservation of ancient Indian learning. Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, non-violent resistance, transformed the Indian independence movement and influenced liberation movements around the world, was deeply shaped by the Jain tradition of his native Gujarat. The principle of ahimsa that he applied to political action, the insistence that the means of a struggle must embody the values of the end sought, owes much to the Jain philosophical framework, mediated through the Vaishnavism of his family's religious tradition. Rest in the gentleness of ahimsa for a moment. The principle of non-harm is not passivity. It is the most demanding ethical stance imaginable, requiring constant attention to the consequences of one's actions for all living beings. But it is also, in its deepest expression, a form of recognition. A recognition that all living things share in something essential, that the boundary between self and other is more permeable than it appears, that the suffering of any living being is, in some deep sense, not entirely foreign to one's own experience. In that recognition, there is something very close to love. Chapter 12. The Nalanda University, the world's first great academy. Roughly 5 kilometers from the town of Rajgir, in the Indian state of Bihar, on a plain that has been sacred to both Buddhism and Jainism for more than 2,500 years, there once stood one of the most remarkable educational institutions in the history of the world. Nalanda University, at its height between the 5th and 12th centuries CE, was a residential center of learning that housed between 3,000 and 10,000 students at any given time, drew scholars from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Mongolia, Central Asia, Persia, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia, maintained a library of 9 million manuscripts spread across 3 large buildings, and offered instruction in Buddhist philosophy, Hindu philosophy, logic, grammar, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and dozens of other subjects. The scale of Nalanda is difficult to comprehend. The university complex covered an area of roughly 14 hectares, about 35 acres, and consisted of 10 temples, 8 large compounds of rooms for students and teachers, meditation halls, classrooms, and extensive gardens. The library buildings, named Dharmaganja, the Treasury of Truth, were said to be so large and so full of manuscripts that when they were burned by the invading forces of the Turkish commander Bakhtiar Khilji in 1193 CE, they burned for 3 months. The burning of Nalanda in 1193 is one of the great cultural catastrophes in the history of India and of the world. The invading forces killed many of the monks and burned the manuscripts that had been accumulating for 700 years. The accumulated scholarly output of the greatest university in Asia, gone in a fire that lasted 3 months. The surviving monks fled to Nepal and Tibet, carrying what manuscripts they could, preserving some of the Nalanda tradition in the monasteries of the Himalayas. But most was lost. The ruins of Nalanda were covered by earth and not excavated until the 19th century. What made Nalanda extraordinary was not merely its size, but its character. It was a place of genuine international intellectual exchange, a meeting point for the Buddhist traditions of China and Southeast Asia and the Tibetan Plateau, for the Hindu philosophical schools of India, for the mathematical and astronomical traditions of the subcontinent. The admission process was reportedly highly selective. A tradition holds that the gatekeeper asked difficult philosophical questions of every person seeking entrance, and that most were turned away. Those who were admitted joined a community of serious scholars engaged in the most advanced intellectual work of their time. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who visited Nalanda in the 7th century CE and spent several years studying there, an account we encountered in the Silk Road script, provides the most vivid description of the university at its height. He describes its architecture, its gardens, its daily routine, its curriculum, and the extraordinary quality of its teachers. He describes debates that lasted for days, in which scholars from different philosophical traditions argued before an audience of thousands. He describes the library, the meditation halls, the elaborate system of rules that governed student life. His account is the closest thing we have to a first-hand description of Nalanda from the inside, and it is remarkable. The subjects taught at Nalanda ranged from the most practically oriented to the most abstractly philosophical. Medicine, Ayurveda, was taught in systematic form, with clinical observation alongside theoretical instruction. Mathematics and astronomy were central to the curriculum. Logic, Hetuvidya, the science of reasons, was intensively studied as the foundation of philosophical argument. Grammar, both Sanskrit grammar and the Prakrit languages of the Buddhist canonical texts, was a major field of study, and at the center of everything was philosophy. The great debates between Buddhist schools, between Buddhist and Hindu positions, between different theories of perception and inference, and the nature of consciousness. The scholars of Nalanda were not monks in the simple sense of the word. They were intellectuals of the first order, engaged in the most demanding philosophical and scientific work of their time, arguing with rigor and subtlety about questions that the greatest minds of their generation had wrestled with for centuries. The tradition of Buddhist epistemology developed at Nalanda by scholars like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, a systematic theory of perception and inference, of how we know what we know, is one of the most sophisticated contributions to the philosophy of mind and epistemology in the history of the world. The loss of Nalanda is one of the reasons that the Indian philosophical tradition is less well known in the West than it deserves to be. The manuscripts that were burned in 1193 contained, we can only guess, philosophical and scientific work of an importance that we will never know. What was in those 9 million manuscripts? What lines of inquiry were being pursued? What problems were being solved? What insights were being refined? We cannot know. The fire took it all. What survived, preserved in the monasteries of Tibet and Nepal and the palm leaf manuscripts of South India, is extraordinary enough. The Indian philosophical tradition, even in its surviving fragments, is one of the great intellectual achievements of humanity. But the sense of loss is there when you contemplate the ruins of Nalanda, those red brick walls, those empty courtyards, those corridors where scholars once walked, arguing about the nature of consciousness, now silent under the Indian sky. Let that loss be gentle tonight. All things end. Even the greatest libraries burn. Even the most sophisticated traditions are disrupted and dispersed. But something persists in the monasteries of Tibet, in the minds of the scholars who fled with what they could carry, in the long chain of transmission that connects the wisdom of Nalanda to the present day. The fire cannot burn what has been understood. It can only interrupt the conversation temporarily before someone picks it up again. Chapter 13. India and the World. What ancient India gave us. As we approach the end of our journey through ancient India, it is worth pausing to consider the full scope of what this civilization gave to the world, not as an act of national pride, but as a genuine accounting of intellectual and cultural gifts that have shaped human life in ways that most people outside India are barely aware of. The most consequential of these gifts is mathematics. The Indian numerical system, 10 digits, including 0, with positional notation, is the foundation of all modern mathematics and computing. When we write the number 123 as 123, we are using a system in which the position of each digit determines its value. The 1 represents 100, the 2 represents 20, the 3 represents 3. This system, which seems so natural and obvious that it is difficult to imagine doing mathematics without it, was not obvious at all. The Romans, who were brilliant engineers and administrators, used a numerical notation: 1, 5, 10, 50, 100, 500, 1,000, that made arithmetic enormously cumbersome. Multiplication in Roman numerals is a genuinely painful exercise. The Indian system made arithmetic simple enough to be taught to children, and in doing so, made possible the entire subsequent development of mathematics. The zero, perhaps India's greatest gift to the world, deserves particular attention. The zero is not merely a placeholder, it is a number, a specific quantity, namely none, and it has specific properties in arithmetic that make it distinct from all other numbers. You cannot divide by zero. Multiplying by zero gives zero. Adding zero changes nothing. These properties are obvious once you have the concept of zero as a number, but they were not obvious to the mathematical traditions of the ancient world that lacked it. The Greek mathematical tradition, despite its extraordinary achievements, was limited by the absence of zero in ways that the Indian tradition was not. The game of chess was invented in India, the ancient game of Chaturanga, which represented the 4 divisions of the Indian army: infantry, cavalry, elephants and chariots, corresponding to the modern pawn, knight, bishop and rook. From India, chess spread westward through Persia, where it became shatrang, then shatranj, and then into the Arab world, and eventually to medieval Europe, where it became the game we know today. The logic of chess, the idea of a game in which 2 opposing forces of equal strength compete through the exercise of pure strategic intelligence, is an Indian idea, and it has been exercising human minds around the world for 1,500 years. Cotton, the fiber from which more human clothing has been made than any other, was domesticated in the Indus Valley more than 5,000 years ago. The cultivation of cotton, the spinning of cotton thread, and the weaving of cotton cloth were all highly developed in ancient India, long before they appeared anywhere else in the world. Indian cotton textiles were among the most sought-after commodities in the ancient world, traded along the Silk Road and the maritime routes to Egypt and Rome and China. The Indian cotton industry was so sophisticated and its product so fine that Roman writers marveled at how it was possible to weave cloth thin enough to be transparent while remaining strong enough to wear. Sugar, in the form of crystallized cane sugar, was first produced in India, and the techniques for its manufacture spread westward along the trade routes, reaching Persia, and then the Arab world, and eventually Europe. The word sugar itself comes from Sanskrit shakara, through Arabic sukar. The cultivation and refining of sugarcane, which would transform the global economy and drive the catastrophic Atlantic slave trade in the early modern period, began in ancient India as a technique for preserving and concentrating the sweetness of the sugarcane plant. The philosophy of non-violence, ahimsa, which we explored in the context of Jainism and Buddhism and Ashoka, has had consequences that reach far beyond the Indian tradition itself. Mahatma Gandhi's application of ahimsa to political struggle, his insistence that the independence of India must be won through non-violent means, that the means must embody the ends, transformed the Indian independence movement and inspired similar movements around the world. The American Civil Rights Movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr., was explicitly modeled on Gandhi's methods. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the Solidarity movement in Poland, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the color revolutions of the post-Soviet era, all drew on the tradition of non-violent resistance that Gandhi developed from the ancient Indian philosophical principle of ahimsa. The medical system of Ayurveda, the science of life, developed in ancient India, is the oldest continuously practiced medical tradition in the world, still used by hundreds of millions of people in India and increasingly studied and adapted in the West. Its emphasis on the whole person rather than isolated symptoms, on the relationship between the individual constitution and the appropriate treatment, on diet and lifestyle as primary factors in health and disease. These are ideas that modern integrative medicine is rediscovering in its own terms. The specific treatments of Ayurveda, herbal medicines, dietary recommendations, physical practices are the subjects of ongoing scientific research, with some showing significant evidence of efficacy. And yoga and meditation, perhaps the most widely adopted Indian gifts to the contemporary world, continue to transform the lives of hundreds of millions of people who practice them. Whatever the context in which they are practiced, secular or religious, in a studio in New York or a monastery in Thailand, these practices carry within them the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of systematic investigation of the human mind. The insight that the quality of attention determines the quality of experience, that the suffering of the mind is often caused by its own habits rather than by external circumstances, that these habits can be changed through practice. This insight, which Indian traditions articulated so clearly and systematically, is at the heart of some of the most important developments in modern psychology and neuroscience. India gave us the number system that makes all modern science possible, the game that has challenged the finest human minds for 15 centuries, the fiber that clothed the world, the philosophy that inspired the greatest non-violent political movements in history, and the practices of yoga and meditation that are transforming the mental health and the daily experience of hundreds of millions of people. And it did all of this from a civilization that at its deepest was motivated not by the desire for power or wealth, though those were certainly present, but by the desire to understand the nature of reality and to reduce the suffering of all living beings. That motivation, ancient and still active, is perhaps the most valuable thing ancient India gave to the world. There is something humbling about this list of gifts. Many of them are so embedded in daily life that we never think about where they came from. The number system you use for everything, the zero that makes digital computing possible, the cotton in the clothes you are wearing, the chess game on your phone, the yoga class you attended, the meditation app on your device. All of these trace their ancestry to ancient India, the civilization that built Mohenjo-Daro's drainage systems and composed the Rigveda's hymns to the dawn and gave the world the zero and the Bhagavad Gita and the tradition of non-violent resistance. This civilization is present in your daily life. in ways you may never have stopped to notice. Noticing matters. Not because ancient India needs our gratitude. It is long past the point of needing anything from us, but because we need the perspective that noticing provides. The modern world did not appear from nowhere. It was built, piece by piece, by contributions from every corner of the human family over thousands of years of accumulated effort and insight. We are the beneficiaries of an inheritance so vast and so complex that no single person can fully comprehend it. And in recognizing that, in pausing to say, this came from there, and this came from there, and this remarkable thing that I take for granted was once someone's great discovery, we cultivate a quality of gratitude and of connection that is itself a form of wisdom. Ancient India has one more gift to offer tonight, and it is perhaps the simplest of all, the reminder to stop, to be still, to let the mind rest from its constant motion. The entire edifice of Indian philosophy, from the Upanishads to the Yoga Sutras, to the teachings of the Buddha to the Bhagavad Gita, points in different ways and with different vocabularies toward the same basic insight, that the restless mind is the source of much of its own suffering, and that the practice of stillness, whatever form that takes, is not an escape from the world, but a return to something more real than the noise. You are practicing that stillness right now, without effort, without technique, simply by lying still in the dark, letting the day go, letting the story carry you toward the edge of sleep. This is the practice. This is already it. The ancient teachers of India would recognize what you are doing. They would nod quietly and say, yes, that, exactly that. And so our bedtime journey through ancient India comes gently, gradually, to its end. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the planned streets of Mohenjo-Daro to the sacred fires of the Vedic hymns, from the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya to the great rock edicts of Ashoka, from the philosophy of the Upanishads to the mathematics of Aryabhata, from the epics of Valmiki to the temple dances of the Devadasi, from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali to the lamp floating down the Ganges in the dark. India is a place that defies summary. It is too large, too varied, too ancient, too alive to be contained in any single description. What we have glimpsed tonight is only a fraction, a few windows into a tradition of extraordinary richness and depth, a few chapters from a story that is still being written, still being argued about, still being lived by more than 1 billion people whose lives are in continuous conversation with the ancient heritage we have been exploring. What India might offer you tonight, as you lie here at the edge of sleep, is perhaps this: a sense of the immensity of time. The Vedic tradition counts time in kalpas and yugas, cosmic cycles so vast that our entire recorded history, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present, fits comfortably within a single day and night of Brahma, the creator god. Against this scale, whatever is troubling you tonight is very small. Whatever you are carrying into this night is a very brief weight in a very long story. And at the same time, paradoxically, beautifully, the Indian tradition insists that the present moment is not small. The Gita tells us to do our duty, fully and wholeheartedly, without attachment to the outcome. The yoga tradition tells us to be present, fully and clearly, in this body, in this breath, in this moment. The Buddhist teaching tells us that this moment, exactly this one, with all its imperfections and its smallness and its ordinariness, is the only place where liberation is possible. Not in some future state, not in some other circumstance. Here, now, in the breath moving in and out of this particular body on this particular night. The ancient Indian traditions knew that the largest and the smallest are not opposites. The ocean is in the drop of water. The universe is in the moment of awareness. Brahman is in the Atman. The whole is in each of its parts, not divided but fully present in each expression of itself. You are not less than the universe tonight. You are an expression of it, a specific, temporary, particular expression, but not separate from the whole. This has been Nap Time Knowledge. Thank you for traveling through ancient India tonight. Let your body be completely at rest. Let your breath be easy and slow. Let the images from tonight's journey settle into the quiet corners of your sleeping mind. The fires of the Vedic ritual, the leaf on the Bodhi tree in the morning breeze, the river at night with its floating lamp, the dancer's hands making the mudras of the gods, the wheel of Dharma turning in the stone at Sarna, where the Buddha gave his first teaching. The monsoon has passed. The stars are very bright over the Ganges. Somewhere a temple bell is ringing. One clear note, and then silence, and then another note, and then silence, in a rhythm as old as the mountains, and as patient as the river. The river Ganga is flowing tonight, as she has flowed for millions of years, carrying her dark water from the Himalayas toward the Bay of Bengal, passing Varanasi, where the ghats are lit by the fires of the cremation grounds and the lamps of the evening Ayati ceremony, where priests wave great flames in circles before the river as an offering, as a greeting, as a declaration that the sacred is here, in this water, on this bank, at this moment. The flames reflect in the water. The water carries them away, and the river flows on. India is very old. Older than its oldest cities, older than its oldest texts, older than the Sanskrit language in which its most ancient wisdom was first recorded. The land itself is ancient. The Himalayas were raised by the collision of continents more than 50 million years ago, and the great rivers that drain them are among the oldest river systems on Earth. The soil of the Ganges plain has been cultivated for 10,000 years. The fire at the center of the Vedic ritual, the fire that connects the human to the divine, has been burning in one form or another since the first humans learned to make it. And out of this ancient land, this ancient practice, this ancient accumulated wisdom, something continues to come. Not unchanged, not unchallenged, not without the failures and the injustices and the contradictions that are the inheritance of every complex civilization, but alive and vital and still capable of offering something that the modern world, for all its extraordinary achievements, has not fully found in itself. That something is, perhaps, the thing the yoga tradition calls prajna, wisdom, not information, not knowledge in the technical sense, but the quality of understanding that comes from having looked clearly and without flinching at the nature of the mind and the nature of suffering and the nature of what it is to be a human being in a world that is both beautiful and painful, both meaningful and transient, ancient India looked at these things with extraordinary care for a very long time, and what it found is still worth finding. You are at the edge of sleep. The thoughts are growing quieter. The body is at rest. And in this quiet, in this rest, something very simple is available. The simple fact of being aware, of being here, of being alive and breathing in the dark. The yoga tradition would call this the Atman, the self, the witness, the one that is always present beneath all the movement. The Buddhist tradition would say there is no fixed self to find, only the awareness itself, clear and open and empty of any permanent substance. But both traditions agree on this. Right here, right now, in the stillness of this moment, something is present that is worth knowing. Sleep well. The river is flowing. The wheel is turning. The fire is still burning. You don't need to name it. You don't need to understand it. You just need to rest in it. Good night.